And I think that's kind of it. We're a community that's trying to have every person in our community have a life-changing encounter with Jesus Christ, and we believe that's done through you and I knowing the path and walking the path. So here we go. We're going to continue our study of Matthew. We're in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to read a lot of verses today. There is a lot of things we could talk about. It's going to take some time. So hopefully it'll be fun. This is a big block of text. You ready? All right, here we go. Jesus starts, so he's teaching his disciples on the hill. I should probably open it up in my Bible as well. He's teaching his disciples, and they're looking at the crowds. And he talks about salt and light, the blessed bees, and then he goes into this. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. We can stop there for now. Okay. That's a little scary, huh? Yes, it is. So, abolishing and fulfilling.
So what's the purpose of the law?
Oh, that's a good question. What's the purpose of the law? Oh, I think we're going to get into that a little more as we get into the future of this. But anybody have any thoughts on that? What is the purpose of the law?
I think it's to keep everybody on track and help everybody with what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Help keep everybody on track, help them what they're supposed to be doing. That's great. Doug?
I found that it helps me to understand the workings of my own heart.
It helps me to understand the workings of my own heart. That's good, right? It points out some things in us that are like, if we're really thinking about what the law actually says, we should be looking at ourselves, right? And saying, do I really fit this? Which we will get into a little more.
It kind of directs you from right and wrong. Like,
Yeah.
what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what's good, what's bad.
Yeah, it's like a compass for life, right? It can guide you and direct you and help you to know, like, okay, I probably shouldn't do this, I should do this. But it's also about more than just that, in a way that he says that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, right? So there's this, getting into this, when a rabbi says that they are fulfilling the law, what it means to a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, is that they are interpreting it correctly and they are walking it out correctly. So when they were to say, I'm fulfilling the law, that means that that's their interpretive lens, and then they walk it out. So it's both of those things together. And abolish has to do with interpreting it wrongly and not walking it out, and or. So if you're interpreting it correctly but you're not walking it out, you're abolishing the law. If you're interpreting it, whatever. If you're not doing both of them, you're abolishing it. But if you're doing both of them, you are fulfilling the law. And Jesus, obviously, we know is the perfect fulfillment. He is the person who's going to walk out what the law really should look like perfectly. And so that's what it's going to look like. And so he's walking out, and if you think about the law, it includes all of the whole Old Testament, right? And so each prophecy has a message. Like, can anybody tell me, the book of Hosea, if you remember, is the book about the prostitute, and Hosea is called to love her. Like, what's the message behind that book? Unconditional love. Is that what you're going to say, Jennifer?
Yeah, I was gonna, like God's relationship with his people.
Yeah.
That he's constantly, like, receiving them back. Even
Yeah.
if they're constantly being adulterous, like, having other idols.
Yeah. Yeah. His people, right, are the unfaithful bride that continuously search out other lovers, and God is constantly giving them another opportunity and another opportunity. And we see that Jesus is going to live that out, right? He's going to fulfill that. And if you look at all the prophets, each prophet and minor prophet has a message that they're trying to get across. And Jesus is going to fulfill that. And he's going to live that out in a way that can be seen. And so, and if we think about this, when Jesus, it seems like a random place in his dialogue at this moment to start talking about, well, don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. So it makes you wonder, were people saying that's what he was coming to do? If we remember the start of this chapter, or the end of chapter 4, is talking about all the crowds, right? And Jesus is talking about the Gentiles, the pagans, all these people, and it's possible that his audience would have said, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, this is a message for the Jews, not for all the people. And so it's possible in that the people started saying about Jesus, oh, he's coming, he's not fulfilling the law properly because look at all these people he's trying to include in his message. This doesn't fit. And so then Jesus addresses with his disciples, people are saying, I'm abolishing the law. I'm actually fulfilling it. You may think that because I think 2 of his disciples were zealots, but had hated the Roman people, but had hated like a lot of the Gentiles, but had just hated a lot of people. And Jesus is trying to include them, and they've been like, is this quite the message I signed up for? And Jesus is saying, this is actually what the law has always been about. So if we can kind of wrap our heads around that. So people might be thinking he's throwing out Torah. And so one of the things that is also interesting is there's this thing called shmikah. Can everybody say that? Shmikah? Shmikah. Right, that's a fun word to say. It means authority. And typically when you're a rabbi, you only get to teach what your rabbi taught you. And so when you're passed on, like you get taught by this rabbi, and you would say, well, my rabbi taught this. But Jesus is teaching in a way that's totally different. And if we look at, we're going to just jump ahead here just a little bit, at chapter 7, verse 28 and 29, it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teachings because he was teaching them like one who had authority, not like their scribes. So Jesus had something different than what a typical scribe would have, where they're just passing on information. He's interpreting the law in his own right, like he has the authority to interpret the law. And not a lot of rabbis would have done that. And I guess there was a special, this is what they think, there was a special ceremony where 2 rabbis with shmikah would like pray over you and anoint you to also have shmikah, the ability to interpret the law and have authority to interpret it. And, so who would have been the 2 that would have given him authority? Anybody have any idea? If that's the method, who would have been the 2 that would have given Jesus the authority to interpret the law?
God and Abraham.
Oh, God, for sure, is one of them, and John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist, baptized him and gave him that authority, and the voice from heaven. So what greater authority? There's no other great. You can't do better than that. And to have God's own blessing on interpreting the law. And so going on from this, Christ fulfills the law, and this is what we're going to get into. We're going to come back to this portion in a second, because this verse 20 is really important. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So what is wrong with the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? And Jesus is going to address it. Anybody have any ideas before we get into it? What do you think is wrong with the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees?
They preach as if they're the ones that you should worship.
Ooh, I think there's part of that too, right? They give these big parades so men can see them and glorify them instead of God. That could be part of it, yeah. Melanie?
Is he setting some kind of standard for them to understand? Because in the people's opinion, how can you be higher than that? So is he
Yeah.
setting kind of a standard, you're not going to be able to do this by yourself?
That could be part of it. I think, yeah, Al.
I think it's more about following rules and without any relationship.
Yeah. Casey?
The scribes and the Pharisees Bible. Like, they offered salvation and they offered the law for money. Like, they were pretty much little, like, quasi-Romans. You know?
Yeah. Well, I think,
They weren't like true Jewish people. I mean, like, they were, but like they didn't follow the Torah the way the rest of the people followed the Torah. They were, well, I mean, like, yeah, they were little mini Romans.
yeah, if you think, so there is a distinction between like the Jewish leadership, which I think is what they are really corrupt, right? The Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, which they're the Sadducees, right? The Sadducees are really, and the Pharisees, yeah, I think in some ways they're corrupt. A little different. I think the Pharisees really think they're doing what's right, but they are just getting it wrong. How many times in our lives have you known someone that really thinks they're doing what's right, but it's like, that's not right? And that's the Pharisees, right? Well,
Reminds me of the verse in Matthew that talks about they honor me with their lips, but
Yeah.
their hearts are far from me.
yes, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Yes. So I think, like what Al was saying, this is really good. What Al was saying is it's about rules and regulations. And just so we know, Torah has 613 commandments. So the first 5 books of the Bible, 613 commandments. And we see throughout the narrative of the Old Testament that the people don't follow him, right? The people don't follow him. So after the exile in Babylon, the people get exiled. Babylon takes all the people away. And then they come up with, they say, well, we can't follow the 613 commandments very well. So if we set up these fences around the commandments so that we don't go over the fence, then we'll never break the commandment. And so they added 3,000 commandments in their Mishnah, and then they added 3,000 more in another writing, and I didn't write it down for some reason. And so they've got like 6,000, and they consider them like fences. There's just these guardrails to keep us from breaking the commandments. And what Jesus is saying is, well, let's get into it here in verse 21. You have heard it said that to people long ago. Now, this is Jesus. This first line is Jesus using his shmikah, his authority. You have heard it said, but I say to you. He's going to say this a whole bunch. Your Pharisees have been interpreting it this way, but I'm telling you that's wrong. I'm interpreting it this way. You have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. Raka means like empty-headed or something like that. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Oof. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. That truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. All right, you can go back to verse 21. You have heard it said, do not murder. So this is the problem. When we think about the Pharisees, when they interpret this law, they would say that it's success just to not murder someone, right? I've won if I just don't murder, right? I've done right by God if I just don't murder. And Jesus is saying, not quite. Because there's a root to murder, right? There's a root, as we'll see, to adultery. There's a root to all these things. And so, why do you think Jesus brought it this far? Like, what is this really about, do you think? Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. And then he goes on with these things. You've heard it said, probably by the scribes and Pharisees, but I say to you. What do you think Jesus is trying to get at here with all this? Lara.
It's really impossible to be righteous.
Could be.
I mean, like Abraham Abraham was righteous through faith.
Yeah.
And Pharisees are all about behavior
Yeah.
and works. And Jesus, I think it says the purpose of the law was to show us to lead us to a
Yeah.
standard because we could not fulfill the law
Yeah.
as we are.
And the book of James says if you break one part of the law, you've broken all of it, right? And so you're subject to all of it. Dad, you really look like some thoughts.
Well, it would seem like it's more the condition of our heart and how we treat others.
Yeah. The condition of our heart and how we treat others. Because if we think about this, we can't take what Jesus is saying as more commands. Because then we're still doing the same Pharisaical issue. Like we're running into the same problem. So if you say, do not be angry, well, okay, that's my command. Don't be angry. Right? Well, then that's the same problem. You just build fences around being angry, and then you're not actually getting to the root of what's happening. And so you can't take what Jesus is saying as more commands, because that's exactly what the Jewish people did, and that's what Jesus is saying isn't right. Is it possible what he's saying is that if you have anger in your heart, you need to check yourself, because the kingdom person has got some of these things dealt with, right? That like if you are of the kingdom, you're not going to want to call your brother empty-headed or a fool. You're not going to want to do this. You're going to want to settle things. And when we think about if you're giving your gift at the altar, and there, remember, this is a sacred ritual. This would be like me in the middle of this message saying, hey guys, I got to go. I've got to go, and I got to reconcile with this person. So we're just going to shut off the service. Think about how serious that is. Because oftentimes we leave so many things like broken, right? And I think the key word here is reconciliation. It's to not just reconcile because you don't want to pay every last penny. It's like being proactive in reconciling. It's just going out and trying to fix relationships and mend relationships, and that's really hard work, isn't it? And oftentimes that it doesn't work out. How many of you try to mend a relationship and the other person doesn't want it to be mended? You know, and yeah, we probably ran into that. Yeah, Craig?
Oh, man. That is one of those things that, like, in recovery for me, trying to work the steps has never really been a way that I've wanted to do it. But when I go to people and they're not ready to forgive, and I can't accept that, sometimes I leave with more resentment than I went there with. Mm-hmm. And that's the struggle. Yeah. And that's where I'm really learning that you can't do anything. You can only do your part.
Yes.
And at that point, yeah.
Absolutely. And at that point, you leave it to God. Paul said is to live at peace with all people as much as it depends on you.
Yes.
Right? So you do the best you can, and if they don't want it, they don't want it. And but at least you don't have that in your heart. Because, there's that classic phrase where it's like, anger and bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die, right? And so it's one of those things that we don't realize how anger can be so poisonous to us, especially anger towards others. And I think what we're going to get at here is Jesus is reminding everyone of the value of someone else, right? And that the other person is valuable. It's not just about you. There's value in the person next to you and the person across from you. There's all sorts of value in other people. So anybody else have any thoughts on this? Yeah.
I had to find the verse, but Matthew 10:38 says, Jesus says, whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And I think as you go along through the Ten Commandments and everything, when he's talking to the Pharisees, this is what he's telling them. He's telling them that there's something new in town and that I have the authority and you're not going to believe me.
And they don't believe him. Yeah. Well, and if we think about this is how I like to think about the law because of Jesus' teachings here. Like if you go and look at any Leviticus like law type statement, it's good to ask, because Jesus does this and he shows us that it can be done with the law, that there's a deeper level to it that we might not have thought about before. Like when he says, don't mix the two different claws together. What is that? Two different fabric types together? Okay, that's really weird. But why? what is the heart, what is the message God is trying to tell his people through that? And so I'd encourage you, maybe as a homework assignment, find some weird, obscure law that has always baffled you, and then look at it like Jesus looks at murder and adultery and those types of things. And ask, what is the intent? Like, why did he tell this to his people? And maybe we can do that right now. Maybe there's anybody can think of an obscure, I mean, we can talk about that one, the two different fabrics. Why would God say, don't mix two different fabrics together? Like, it was part of a command. Like he said, you can't do that when you're creating clothes. Why? Yeah.
It's another maybe metaphorical way to talk about unequally yoked relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
Something that they would understand, because at that time they were truly making their own cloth.
Yeah.
Two different fibers, synthetic fiber and a natural fiber, will pull against each other until they literally tear each other apart.
Hey, good stuff. You know your fabric. That's good. Yeah, Mom?
Same as putting, he says you can't put new wine in old wineskins.
Yeah.
Because it'll burst.
Yeah.
And so I think it's similar to that. It just pulls apart.
Yeah. And I think too it was a part of that about not being like staying pure, not being tainted. What is this? Pure and undefiled religion is this. What is it? It's in James. Anybody finish what I'm trying to say?
Remember the widows and orphans.
Yeah, the widows and orphans, and to be undefiled by the world. Yeah, keep oneself from being polluted by the world, right? And so there's this aspect when it comes to the two claws. There's a metaphor behind it, right? And that's saying something deeper. And I think you can do that with every Old Testament law, where you can ask the question, what is really being said here on like a practical, applicable level? Al.
I think what he's saying here is like with the cloth, I mean, you can't be one cloth when we're not around other people or around those of church, and then have this other shiny cloth that we bring to church, and that's where we give our offerings and stuff like that. Because
That'll preach.
there's no righteousness in that. It's just
Yeah.
keep tearing apart,
Yeah.
and you'll never get where you need to go, which just means you're just going to end up not going to heaven because you didn't make
Yeah.
things the right way.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, that's exactly right. You won't end up going to heaven because when it's just a command, right? One of the things about knowing Jesus and walking the path of Christ is that there should be a change in you, right? And it's not just about, well, I've got to just stop myself here. No, there's got to be like something in your heart that changes. And sometimes that change occurs over time, of course, but if we're just like, if I'm not murdering someone, but I'm just mad at everybody and I want to murder everybody, right? And I've got this person, I'm like, I'm thinking about how I can kill you, and I'm thinking about how I can beat you up, and thinking about all that stuff. Well, what's the difference, right? Because eventually, if I'm in the right situation, and this is the problem, we'll get into it with adultery. If I'm in the right situation and I've done all this pondering and all this building up, I might actually kill you. And so, like, it's the thing that leads to the next thing, right? And so let's read about adultery, because these two go hand in hand. You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Woo! We can go back to 27. Okay, what do we think of that one, you guys? Yeah, Tim.
When he's spewing these things and he's saying, you know, we've heard the Old Testament ways, but this is the further. So we're no longer under the covenant of the Old Testament. We're under the new covenant.
Yeah. Yep.
That's not to say, in my eyes, and I got into this understanding with somebody else, and they thought, well, we're not under that covenant anymore, is the way he looks at it. And so, like, we just don't read the Old Testament. We're under the new, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question.
We still use the Old Testament.
Well, right. If you think about this in this way, right? Jesus says, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And then he goes on to talk about the law, right? And how we're supposed to live it out. So he actually doesn't say, oh no, get rid of, we don't need that anymore. He actually goes on to expand on the law itself in what we're looking at. And so the law is definitely still a guidepost. And if you think about the law as the foundation of a house, right? Without the foundation of the house can't stand. And that's the Old Testament. It's the foundation that builds the New Testament, right? So without it, there's nothing there. And that's why it's good to understand the Old Testament, because if we don't understand any of the Old Testament, the New Testament doesn't make a lot of sense. Like if you read Hebrews and all about atonement, talks about the Old Testament, like what the old sacrifices were for and all that. And so without a basic knowledge of both, you can't really understand the new if you don't understand the old. And the old, I think, is a lot more helpful and applicable than we realize it is. Elizabeth.
So you were saying how like the Pharisees they would put laws around the laws.
Yep.
From breaking that law.
Yep.
But it almost seems like Jesus is doing that too, because they're saying like you first said, do not commit adultery, which is, that law.
Yeah.
He's saying if you look at someone, they can
Yeah.
cry out or like
Right. Right. Which is a good point. It's a good point. I like it. And that's where I think, yeah. I don't know if we could take what Jesus is saying as a command, because that's what he's critiquing. So the heart of this is do not commit adultery, and I think what we're seeing, again, is we need to look at the other person like they have value. Because if you think about, if you're a guy or if you're a girl, girls do it now too. Now, they've probably always done it. You see some ripped jack guy, definitely not me. But they see some ripped jack guy or whatever, and they go, woo, or whatever. The guy is doing cat calls, whatever. There's an aspect of a total disregard for the humanity of the other person. It's just looking at them as an object, and I think Jesus is bringing to light that people aren't just objects. You can't just harbor hatred towards this person, and you can't just look at this person however you want, because they haven't submitted to that. They haven't said yes to that. Sean.
So kind of address Elizabeth's concern or comment there. For me, it's always been a difference between understanding and accepting God in my head versus my heart. And it's a difference of trying to do things, works, to get to heaven, right, on my own abilities and my own strengths and my own doings, versus accepting God's grace and his love and his mercy and having a relationship with Jesus.
Yes, I was going to say something along these lines, and then I lost it. When we build fences around the commandments, when we create commands for commands for commands, the heart doesn't change, right? And it's just it's all like, okay, I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm still gonna. I know I shouldn't look at this woman lustfully, but I'm still gonna do this. And I know I shouldn't commit adultery, but I'm still gonna watch porn. I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm still gonna do that. And because when we don't think about like the deeper levels, and I think that's what Jesus is getting at, is this was always the intent of do not commit adultery. It was for you to look deeper inside and ask, what's actually gonna change my heart, not just like the little bit I do, Zach.
It kind of feels like how a child might respond to a parent's instruction. So like when I grew up, like mom and dad would be like, you can only have so many sweets, or like you can have a cookie. And like as a kid, it's like, for me there were like two options. It's like, okay, how can I like logic my way around this one cookie so I can have more?
Yeah.
Friend's house, is that a different cookie that I can have over there and then one here? Or am I going to be like super legalistic about it and be like, well, I can only have one cookie and just find rules. Whereas the heart behind it was, we want you to be healthy so you can do all these fun things and maybe not get sick or something. So it kind of feels like that could be an element.
Yeah. I don't know who is next here. Mom?
I feel like what Jesus is saying is that if we cleanse and purify our hearts, our external behaviors will change.
Yeah. If we can get to the heart of the matter and actually change our hearts and not just if we're not focused, if we're only focused on behavior, our hearts don't change. But if we're focused on a heart change, our behavior changes, if that makes sense. It's just like an outcome of kingdom living. It's not something that has to be forced, or it's not like, okay, well, I got to do this and then that. But if you're focused on like changing the way you think, that's what Paul said, like you would be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? By thinking differently. Yes?
I kind of wanted to add to what she just said there is when Jesus starts stating the new commandments in the Bible, he just expands further onto them. It kind of brings up the point to me is what you pay attention to, what you focus on will come out of your heart.
Yeah? Yeah. Well, okay, yes, absolutely. Well, if you didn't hear what he said, what you pay attention to, what you focus on is going to come out, right? And this is the problem with adultery, is if you imagine, probably these Pharisees or whatever, and most people, right, if we look at the commandment, most of us would interpret this, do not commit adultery. So I can do everything right up to that point. I can look, I can maybe even touch, I can do all these things right up to that point. As long as I don't cross that line, I'm good. And God is saying, if we interpret it like that, we're totally missing the point altogether. Because it's not about that. And I still remember there was this kid that asked this guy, if God is who he says he is in the Bible, why don't Christians just do whatever they want? And this man responded, he said, when your mom asks you to do something, why do you do it? And the child says, well, because I love her. And he said, that's exactly our motivation as believers, why we should, if we're just trying to fulfill the law, right, well then we can go right up to the point of murder, we can go right up to the point of adultery, and do what we want. But if we're doing it because we love God, well then we're going to be like, well, actually, I know that in my heart what I'm doing isn't right, and I know that he sees all things, and so I want to please him above all, and so I'm gonna try to deal with my heart behind it. Al.
I keep going back to the fact we talked about righteousness, about the Pharisees and scribes.
Yeah.
And Young's little translation talks about members, not with I. And I think part of it's your lifestyle. Like if you're holding on to that one relationship because you don't want to let go of something that God says you need to put boundaries up until they change.
Yeah.
Like this can't be part of your life. Let's be above that. You know, if they can cause you to stumble, you need to let them go. If there's something in your life, like whether it's a relationship or a place you go or whatever it is, it's about the righteousness of the two. It's not necessarily adultery. It's what is going to cause you to fall back into something that you should not fall back into.
Yeah, if you bring up let's talk about this. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. What do you guys think about that? Ouch. Just go get some spoons, huh?
One-eyed men around.
There should be a lot more one-eyed men around. That's right. Well, what's interesting, too, is he specifically says your right eye. I was just thinking about this morning. I don't have an answer to this. Why your right eye? Because you still have your left.
It'll tend to be dominant.
Your dominant eye? That makes sense. Jennifer?
I think I had read that, like when, you know, like in the Testament when there was like a lot of fighting, they would take like people's, their shooting finger and their right eye, but they would leave them with their left eye because they couldn't, like attack their enemy. So it's the
Interesting.
eye that helps them to.
Interesting. You know, I've always interpreted this verse as, this is obviously hyperbole. Otherwise, I think a lot of the disciples and people following Christ, there was a guy named Origen. He's like an early church father who he I guess, castrated himself, and in response to these teachings. And there's another guy, monk who did that, and I can't remember what his name was. Andrew Heller knows. But there's another monk, I guess, who did that, but then in his writings he talks about how actually doing that didn't change his heart. He still struggled, even though he had castrated himself. And so I always took this to mean, whatever your circumstances are, do whatever is extreme to give you that heart change. Like, whatever it's going to take. Like, if you need to make a big change in your circumstances, we'll do it. Because that's going to help guide that heart change. That's kind of how I've always interpreted it, although I don't know if that's correct. If you read a book, The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard, he has a different interpretation of it, which I'm pondering. don't know if I agree with. I could tell you what it is in a second, but yeah.
I think it definitely nods to pruning. So if you want to think about gardening, which I really don't, but I held to
That's
the
interesting.
metaphor. That when you have a tree that is very fruitful, it has been tended to and modeled and really worked and pruned back significantly by the gardener. So you have someone that knows the tree very well, knows what fruit it's going to bear and what places that it needs. You know, the most fruit on a branch will break the branch if there's too much fruit. So the gardener will sometimes cut off that entire branch to allow new growth to happen and to cultivate better things.
Yeah. Maybe there's parts in our lives we need to cut off, and it's going to create all sorts of new fruit in our lives. That's good. Hey, yeah.
Looking a little bit off of that, she said the gardener.
Yeah.
And the key is the gardener. It's not us changing our heart.
Yeah.
God can change our heart.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amen. Melanie.
I'm just thinking, like, if there's sin in your life, it's going to be difficult sometimes to get rid of it, and it'll take maybe a really hard sacrifice.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. And
Yeah.
I think to me, that's like what it's saying. It's like plucking out your eye and throwing away wouldn't be an easy thing to do. It's difficult.
Yeah. Well, and I think too that there's an aspect, like if I tell you about my little personal journey with like pornography, I just had struggled with it for such a long time, and there was about a year there where I locked down my phone and I put this password on this thing, and I got the software that wasn't made for blocking that stuff, but I made it work because I couldn't find anything else. And my wife had to put in a password if I didn't have an internet browser, no social media. I couldn't get into the settings on my phone, couldn't do anything for about a year. And it was really annoying because people would ask me, like, well, what's that verse? And typically I just Google it. But it's like, well, I don't have a web browser. I don't have this, I don't have that. And so it was just a really inconvenient time, but it set the stage for freedom for me. It was just a time where I just had to put it all aside. And I think for me, that kind of command, right, for me to do that and take that step helped change my heart helped give me some distance between me and my addiction to say, okay. And I got some freedom from it and was able to take a step back. Doug.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but Jesus is setting a stage here for a refocus and a solution of, well, how can we fix these things without building another whole set of laws
Right.
from the first set. Then it goes into chapter 6 and 33. Here's one. Seek first the kingdom of God
Yeah.
and righteousness, and these things will be solved.
Yeah. I should say, along with that, I took a year with my phone being dumb, and I woke up early, and I prayed, and I read my Bible. I think those things coupled together is what really made the difference in my life. You seek first the kingdom, and I think oftentimes when we think about addictions, we think about sin, we think about, well, I just have to stop, and then I'll be good. You have to replace it with something. You replace it with seeking the kingdom, right? And I think that's part of it. You take the practical steps you need, but you also have to replace it. Mom, you're next, then we'll go to Craig.
For you, like in a positive sense, what was in comparison to before and after? How did you feel?
Oh, man. The before and after, there's a lot of, there's more reasons than that I shut my phone up. I have this theory about Google and things in our technology lives. I think that, and we're going to see this more and more with AI on the rise and things like that. Oh, I shouldn't get into this. I think we're seeing that humanity in general, we're super reliant on our devices. Like, just for example, I don't need to have a good memory of the scripture because I've got Google. I can just remember just this little sentence, and that'll lead me to the rest of the verse. So I don't need to remember it, and that was part of the reason I took it off, is because I wanted to know the scripture better, and I knew I didn't need to know it better if I had my technology. And so I think there's an aspect to it as well where there was a lot more behind it for me than just porn. It was also like I want to learn to think better, to remember things, and to be proactive in trying to recall things. And so for me, the difference was, I don't know, it's been a really slow change. And I think the change has been like over time, over years. And I think, like I said last week, we live day to day, but we measure ourselves in decades, right? And so, like, when I think to 10 years ago, the way I think about women and all these things has changed so much. And obviously, I still got some issues and still got some heart problems that need to be dealt with. But it's like I know that I've progressed, that things have changed for me. But I also know that there's still some some mind transforming that needs to happen as well. So I'm definitely not there yet. Anna?
I kind of a question or thought. I'm trying to figure out the connection between our minds and our hearts. Because what we're talking about is that we can choose our path with our minds, but our heart will be like sometimes slow to follow.
Yeah.
And even with forgiveness, you can choose to forgive someone, and you're choosing the direction you're going to go, but your heart takes a while to come around sometimes. It's so.
Yeah, the heart is deceitfully wicked, right? That's beyond cure. Who can know it? Yeah, that's often, that's what I experience in my life. And I think in our culture, we have this really strong, this is in secular culture as well as Christian culture. We think about charismatic culture in general. We criticize our secular culture for doing well, just follow your heart, be who you are, be who you're called to be. But Christian culture does the same thing. And we just are like, well, the Spirit told me to do this, and I think I ran into so many people where it's just like, man, the Spirit didn't tell you to just be totally flaky and drop all your obligations. You agreed to do this, and now it's this convenient excuse to not follow through. And I think there's this aspect of our hearts that we oftentimes we shouldn't listen to our hearts at all, right? And like, because we know, and I've been wondering this in my own life, because we all go through spiritual phases, the spiritual formation. We go through all these different stages. And I'm at a stage in life right now where, I was telling you guys about how the Lord is speaking to me like a week ago and challenging me on the issues of trust. But there's oftentimes when I was younger and I was in a situation with somebody where I would feel like God would be telling me what to do. And I've done a lot of study of the Scripture and things like that. And now I feel like I'm at a point where when I encounter someone who's poor and needs help, I don't need the Lord to tell me what to do. I know what to do. I know what He said. I know I should do it. So why would He have to tell me? And I feel like it's one of those things like when you're married and you're cleaning up the house. Like my wife doesn't have to tell me everything to do in the house. Like I know, we've been there through the routine. I clean the kitchen, she cleans the living room and the dining room, and like we have our routine, and I feel like it's the same way in our own lives sometimes. Like I think we're always really reliant on what is being said to our heart, or like how we feel in the moment, but I just don't know that that's an accurate compass all the time. I think sometimes it's really accurate, but then you have to have discernment to know, like, when is the Spirit speaking to your heart and telling you what to do, and when are you just trying to find something that's going to, I think oftentimes we follow teachers who teach what our itching ears want to hear. Yeah, Zach.
Yeah, and
I'm sorry, did that help? I don't know, that was kind of a rant.
well, there's an interesting scientific connection between like the head and heart, if you're talking kind of heart and emotions, because some people talk about like if you're feeling depressed, there's a physiological, like your shoulders are hunched, you maybe sit hunched over, which decreases the lung capacity. So just getting with someone who's maybe sitting like that and feeling depressed to sit up straight, take breaths from their diaphragm will help alleviate some of the emotions sometimes. Or also like the power pose. So if you're going into an interview or presenting something, people suggest like putting your hands on the hips, standing up straight like Superman, just for like 30 seconds to a minute, even in like a bathroom stall before you go into something like that, to get your body to change a little so you feel, so some of those emotions of feeling more confident might follow. Not necessarily for everybody, and it's more complex, but there is that like connection between the head and the heart.
I like that. C.S. Lewis also, he talks about in the Screwtape Letters about how one of the games of the enemy is to try to convince us that posture doesn't matter. like physical posture. When we're in prayer, when we're seeking God, like he's saying, like physical posture does matter when in our encountering of God, like sitting up straight, not just laying down and falling asleep. Like if you want to encounter God, you got to position yourself physically in a way to receive. Craig.
So many people have talked about when your heart is changing.
Yeah.
I've just found, and I mean, I'm early in that heart changing, but you tend to recognize those bad thoughts and where they're coming from. You know, all of a sudden, and my dad taught me 5-second rule. Send it. Get rid of it. And it's really, really been working for me. Because I mean, as men, as women, those thoughts, they're going to happen.
Yeah.
But realizing where they're coming from and how you deal with them,
yeah,
heart is changing, it makes such a big difference.
Well, and like the false man is always going to, like we all have a false person, right? There's like a true self in Christ, and then there's the false self, the old self. And that where the old is gone and the new has come, but sometimes that old rears its head, right? And all of a sudden we're thinking things we haven't thought in a while, and we're thinking about doing something we haven't done in a while, and it's recognizing, yeah, oh wait, this is the false man, this is the false self. I'm going to put it aside because this does not belong. Yeah.
One of the things that I heard in what you were just talking about was like when you started talking about like your routine, you started talking about like I know what needs to be done.
Yeah.
But part of a routine is building healthy habits, and sometimes you build a habit that like this is what I do every day. And then but you see this other stuff that needs to be done, and maybe your wife is like she's running late at work or whatever, and it still needs to be done, but you're like, this is my routine.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's really hard to force yourself to step out of that comfort zone of what you've already built in and do something else.
Yeah. You know, yesterday it's interesting. Yesterday I was sitting and I was reading the Bible, and my kids were kind of jumping all over me, and I was reading, and then they wanted me to read them some Muppets book, and I was like, well, I want to finish my chapter. And then I was thinking about this, interpreting the heart of the law. And I was like, Jesus would probably want me to put my Bible aside and spend time with my kids. And I can finish this chapter later. And so that's what I did. Because I think sometimes the routine becomes the command, right? And then we lose the heart of the routine that we started in the first place. And it's just, oh man, being human is just kind of frustrating, isn't it? And so let's continue on. We should finish this up. We're almost out of time. It's a really good discussion. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her a victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Is that all that one says? Yes, okay. So we'll stay here for a second. There was two schools of thought back in Jesus' day. There was this big, we'll get into this more later. There was this big rabbinical battle between, it's kind of a battle, big interpretive rabbinical battle between a guy named Shammai and Hillel. Shammai and Hillel. And they had all these different interpretations of the law and all sorts of different things. And so when Jesus weighs in on some things, he's actually weighing in on one side of an argument that's already pre-existed to him by quite a ways, by these two major rabbis. And he takes, typically when Jesus talks about the law, he takes Hillel's side. And we'll talk more about that later, how Hillel interprets the scripture. But in this particular one, Hillel taught that if your wife, or if you're married and your wife salts the food too much, you can divorce her. If you're married and literally, if your wife does anything you don't like, you can divorce her. And Shammai taught the opposite, right? That you can't do that. Obviously, I think today we would say that's ridiculous. But it's really what they would do. And the problem comes down to the way society was set up at that point. If you were to divorce your wife would then, if they had a certificate of divorce, there's a chance she could remarry, but it's pretty unlikely. And it's actually pretty likely she ends up becoming a prostitute. And so really, I think what Jesus is saying is this is about you think it's all about you men just being able to do whatever you want and have subject over whoever you want. And I would like to tell you that all these things Jesus is saying have the same heart issue. like with adultery, you're imposing your will on someone else. When you look at them lustfully, it's like you're imposing that on someone else. When it comes to divorce, it's Jesus saying, no, you need to think about your wife. You need to think about what's going to happen to her. She's not just an item you can discard and throw away. You need to think about what happens when you divorce her if she becomes a prostitute, and that's on you because of your flakiness, which goes right into oath making, right? And I would like to argue that actually all these things are directly connected. It's one leads to the other, leads to the other. And because then it says, don't break your oaths. And interesting, that it would come right after divorce. But I'm not saying, I think back when they used to teach, like, divorce is never permissible and it's never acceptable. And I think there's lots of complications in all our lives. And I think the Lord would agree because He made us and the world we live in. So, anybody have any thoughts on that one before we move on? That's kind of a touchy subject. Probably get into it more later. All right, keep going. Verse 33. Again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is His footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no, and anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Ooh. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So, let's think about this in an interpersonal type of way. Why shouldn't we make oaths? When I think about you and me talking, and one of us is going to make an oath, typically, why do you make an oath? Like, I swear, I promise. Like, typically, why do you do that? Yeah.
You're making a promise. So if you can't keep it, don't make it. Don't make that oath.
Yeah. Yeah, but like if you're in a situation where maybe you're talking to somebody and you're saying you promise, typically, why do we do that?
Because they were still intended.
Maybe we're lying. Maybe to prove a point. Maybe we know we don't have their trust, so we want to manipulate them into giving us their trust. Yeah. And so I think typically, like when I stopped making promises a long time ago when I was in high school because I saw what Jesus taught, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to stop doing that. And it's really nice not to do that, actually, because then, like, these oaths put this huge obligation on you to fulfill it, unless you're just trying to manipulate people, which I would argue almost every time we make a promise, it is a form of manipulation, because we're trying to impose, again, our will onto somebody else. The reason we make a promise is because we want done what we want done, and we want them to do what we want. Yeah.
I was just thinking, if someone knows you, they know when you say yes, it means yes.
Yeah.
Say no, it means no. And so you don't have to make that oath. I mean,
yeah.
if someone doesn't know you, you could be trying to, it's
yeah.
a issue,
but also if someone knows you.
Yes and your no means no, there's no need for it.
Absolutely. But if somebody does know you and they know that your yes doesn't mean yes and your no doesn't mean no, you might feel obligated to make a promise. And no, I swear it's different this time. I'm not going to do that again. And Al.
Well, at some point you're going to break that promise or that oath.
Yeah.
You can't uphold everyone.
No, and this is what he's getting at too. There's a part where he talks about do not take an oath at all, either by heaven or by its throne. Listening to a guy who was saying that back in this day they would have a tiered oath system. Of course they would. Where it was like, well, I promise you by the gold on the altar. Well, and then they would go to the next guy and say, well, I promise you by the altar itself. So now I promised on something greater so I could ignore the former, right? And when that guy comes up to me, I can say, well, I'm sorry, I made a promise to you on the gold of the altar, but I made a promise to this other guy on the altar itself, so therefore I can ignore the promise I made to you. It's kind of ridiculous. But again, it's that form of getting what you want. And I think there's this this kind of repeated thing of like, you can get what you want, but it's going to be at the expense of somebody else. And Jesus continues to say that, sure, you can be mad and hang on to that, but it's at the expense of somebody else. Sure, you can look at a woman lustfully, but it's at the expense of somebody else. Sure, you can have a divorce and make your wife a prostitute, but that's at her expense. Sure, you can make an oath, but it's at the expense of somebody else. And so what he's really getting at, right, is we need to start thinking about other people and the consequences of our actions. Yeah.
Thought that just occurred to me. Sometimes oaths become compromises. And I think one of the things that Jesus is trying to teach us is that there is no compromise between what he's talking about and what the Pharisees are talking about.
Yeah, that's good. There's no compromise. And I think, too, worship team, you can come up. We got to finish this thing. And so we've talked about this before, but I want to make clear that as we've talked about things like Elizabeth brought up, doesn't this just sound like more commandments? I think that the kingdom isn't about doing, it's about being. Right? If that makes sense? It's not just about a list of actions and rights and wrongs and things like that. And because I'll tell you right now that when I took all those actions to change my own life, there is still problems in my heart that have to be dealt with. And I'm still praying that God would change. And so actions alone don't change things. It's not about doing, it's about being. It's not about doing the kingdom, it's about being a part of the kingdom and being a kingdom person. Tim?
If you're being, you're automatically going to do.
Yes.
Not necessarily if you're doing, you're not automatically being.
Yeah, that's good. If you're being, you're automatically going to be doing, but if it's not necessarily the other way around. And that's good. Yeah, Travis, woo!
All right. So, an oath, why do we say vows?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Oh.
Yeah.
Why do we dedicate our children? Oh man, maybe I'm all wrong. No, I think there's an aspect. Yeah, I think it comes down to the heart, right? Yeah, you're right. Well, it comes down to the heart, because obviously I made an oath to my wife, and that was after high school. But it comes down to the heart, right? And you commit yourself to someone else. And it's saying, I am committing to you. And, I'm not going anywhere. And, yeah, Dad.
Say your vows, you should let your yes be yes and your no be no. That in your heart, you should never change.
Yeah.
You should always be faithful.
Yeah.
It's usually unfaithfulness that brings, whether it be opposite sex or distractions or whatever, that something wrong with the heart that separates couples.
Yeah.
God says he hates divorce because of those things, but he doesn't hate divorce people.
Yeah.
So it's the heart issue again. So we need to say yes to our brides and keep it that way. Let it be known, because your heart's wrong if you let it be known.
Yeah. Well, and I think oftentimes too, when it comes to our culture and Christian culture today, we treat the marriage day itself as if it's like the end goal, and it's really it's the beginning. The end goal is dying together, right? Dying when you're old together, still being together. That's the goal. But I think I remember when I was young, I was just thinking about getting married. It was that was it, and I didn't think about all the holy moly stuff that I always tell people that getting life is God is shaping you, but when you get married, it's like you get put on the anvil and start getting hit with a hammer, being put into shape. Yeah, I think that's been my experience. When I got married, it was like, holy moly, I am a messed up human. I got a lot to change. Yeah, Anna.
When we were married, we said, I do.
Yeah.
I swear it by the gold of the temple.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do. And we made that commitment before God and men. So it's a little different. It's not.
Still a little different flavor to it, yeah. Yeah. Still, it's a big, and I don't know. I think
It's like none of this has changed from the beginning, what you started talking about, to this point. It's all about the heart.
Yeah.
That's what I think Jesus was saying with all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what his argument for the Pharisees is, unless you surpass their righteousness, unless you can, if it's all about commands, yet your heart is just wicked, and you're always trying to get things that you want and using others for your own gain and doing all these things, well, then none of this is any use to you, because it's not actually affecting you the way it's supposed to. But if it is about a heart change, and if action is going to come as a result of being and living that heart change, well, then you're getting it, right? Then that's really, and I think that's kind of what Paul alluded to when he talks about the Gentiles becoming a law unto themselves, right? They understand some of the heart of the message even without having known it. Yeah. Everybody would stand with us. We're going to end in some worship. And so I think maybe a question to be asking ourselves is like, where's your heart at when it comes to these things? Maybe look at an area of your life like anger. Are you angry with people? Are you filled with lust? Are you trying to manipulate people into getting what you want? Like look at all these things and maybe ask the Lord, like, Lord, how can I also fulfill this like you fulfilled it? How can I interpret this correctly and live it out like I'm supposed to? And why don't we just spend time in some prayer real quick. Jesus, we just ask you for a heart change. Father, for what we've taken as law and interpreted as law, God, but it hasn't formed us and shaped us in the way that you've intended it to. Lord, we just ask that you would bring what only you can bring, that heart change. Lord, that conviction from your Holy Spirit. We want to be like you, Jesus. We want to walk the path like you did, like you are, Lord. And we want to embody, God, the law in the proper way and what it really meant. Not just to say I did the thing, but to really live it out well. Lord, so we just surrender our anger to you, surrender lust to you. We surrender always trying to get our way to you. We just ask that you change us, that you shape us into the men and women, God, that we're supposed to be. And that you just point out anything in us. Help us to be honest with ourselves and not to be afraid of that honesty and that deeper look. And we want to go deeper. We want to know you more. God, and we know that as we get to know you more, God, we get to know ourselves more, and we get to see some of the uglier parts of ourselves. And just pray that you'd help us to deal with that well in a way that's honoring to you. We love you, God, and we want to be like you. So help us to be like you. Help us not to just be, as my dad used to say, human doings, but human beings, that the kingdom beings, God, that we're just going to be of the kingdom, and we're not going to hold grudges. We thank you for your word that challenged us this morning. We ask that it just sink deep into our hearts, and that our roots will grow down deep into Christ. We thank you. In Jesus' name.